deploying and testing ColdFusion applications. I kind of put it all together under the title Pragmatic ColdFusion. If any of you all have heard me talk at these before, you know, it's me still pounding the same drum I've been pounding for a couple of years now about automating tests, automating build processes, automating deploy processes, and just kind of getting out there with the tools that are in the world, used in a lot of other environments, and getting web applications up and running effectively and quickly. I'm John. I work at a company down in the Shenandoah Valley, a couple hours south of here, and it's one of the reasons I'm very excited to talk about the whole build, test, deploy world. It seems like that's what I end up doing a lot of times. I frequently get brought in for software projects, and a lot of the times I find out that there's a lot of infrastructure that's missing that makes the deployment process really hard, which makes the testing process really hard, which makes the building process really hard and unreliable, and all of those things contribute to what seems like code problems, and a lot of times process fixes a lot, and then you can focus a lot more on code because the processes were taking up so much time. So I want to talk real quick about how to be pragmatic. Pragmatic means dealing with things sensibly and realistically in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. Basically, it's what do people do in the trenches? What have people found out through real life, building things, testing things, and deploying things that's going to help them make code better and faster and easier to deploy? Because no one, how many people are afraid to deploy code? How many people would be comfortable right now if the network was live and fast, deploying a new version of your application right from this room? Yeah, not so many hands. And there's no reason you should be scared of deploy. You know, deploying to a new server should not be something scary. It shouldn't be something that makes you break out in a cold sweat. Building your application, if you've got something that you ship, which is not really what happens in the ColdFusion world for most people, but it shouldn't be a scary process. And usually it's scary because you've been burned before. And people tend to get burned because they've done things that probably weren't the smartest possible way they could do them. And what we've done is taken a lot of people getting burned over years and years of building web applications, and there's a few general principles about how not to get burned, how to be lazy, how to be relaxed, how to not have to worry, how to be able to drink a beer while you are deploying your web application and not feel afraid. And so we're going to take those pragmatic things that have been learned by people across all sorts of software disciplines. It's not just ColdFusion people that deploy web applications, and honestly, ColdFusion means nothing as far as what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to have to talk about any ColdFusion code. This is about deploying your ColdFusion code. There's a couple of things I can mention specifically about ColdFusion, but deploying web applications is something lots of people have done in lots of languages, and they all keep running into the same problems over and over and over. So what I'd start is actually a little bit of a demo here. And what I'm going to do is show you just a really lame build process that is probably good enough for a lot of shops. I use a tool called Ant. We're going to talk more about that in a second. It's a standard open source Java tool written by a guy named James Duncan Davidson, who also wrote a little thing called Tomcat, which is the original Java web application server. James is a very, very smart guy, and he got tired of getting burned. And it's very Java-centric, which is why in the ColdFusion world it makes a lot of sense. If you're in different environments, there are other tools that may or may not be a better choice. If you're a Ruby person, Rake would be an alternative. But in the ColdFusion world, I like talking about Ant because Ant is really reliable. ColdFusion under the hood is all Java, and so we might as well use Java tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do an Ant deploy real quick, and that's going to churn while I babble. So what Ant is doing, everything that I forget to do, everything that's on that little checklist next to my list of what I want to do before I roll an application out, I put it into Ant because that way I never have to think about it again. Never again do I have to think about it. The computer thinks about it. What are computers good at? Computers are good at doing things over and over and over without complaining. That they're good at doing things that you don't like to do that are too simple for you. Well, let the darn computer do that stuff and let you focus on smart stuff like writing code. So what did I do? We're going to break down what caused all this to happen under the hood. But I did some initialization steps. I did some sort of export, and you see SVN stuck in there. Uh-oh, I'm using version control. That's scary. Then I did some sort of build, and then I did some sort of deploy, and it took about 3 seconds for this teeny, tiny app. It'll take longer for a bigger app. Usually the thing that takes a lot of time is file transfer. File transfer and copy is what drives the length of time this takes, because in the ColdFusion world, rarely do we have to do a lot of things like compiling Java and things like that. But so that's my demo. That's the build process. That is the file that you all can take and start building your own build process from. And you know, you're thinking that maybe I'm being a little blasé about how complex it is to do this. I'm not, because this ant file is pretty straightforward. I built this all using open source tools in an afternoon, and there are plenty of ways, if you spent more than a couple of hours with it, to make it even better. And I'll touch on some of the things you could do to make this very simple sort of build template work for you. But this is the kind of thing that I take in a lot of times because it gets the job started. It gets us an automated build process in place, and boy, does it sound good on your first day at the end of the day to say, yeah, now we've got the build automated. It's done. We're ready. And now we can move on and make it better. So let's break these things into pieces. There's a guy named Mike Clark who wrote a book that's extremely outdated now called Pragmatic Project Automation from the Pragmatic Programmers. And he has this thing, and you can maybe see the darker characters there at the beginning. He says builds should be crisp. Why am I starting to talk about builds? Well, being able to deploy something, being able to test something, the very first step you need to be able to make a build. You need to be able to have software you're ready to release, whether that's release into testing, release to test and deploy, release to ship to your end user, however the software ends up being pointed, whatever direction it ends up in, you still need to be able to build it. So he had this great acronym, because acronyms are important to us in the software industry. The very first thing is complete. Builds need to be complete. Every single thing you need to run that application needs to be in the build. And this comes up time and time again. I have builds that are 8 to 12 gigabytes because there's 1,000 ColdFusion templates and there's 11 and a half gigs of movies and video for like a training company I work with. That's okay. Disks don't cost that much. I would much rather make sure that I have the entire build there, so I know I'm testing the whole thing, than to forget that, oh yeah, I have to do these two separate processes and make sure all the movies are copied up too, and deploy my app and forget the movies because I decided to make that a manual step. I'd rather put it all together. Later on, if I decide to get really smart and separate out the 8 gigs of data in the movies from the rest of my data and have some sort of sexier deploy, that's fine, but I'd rather also start simple. Because I know if it's simple, it's hard for me to mess it up. So a complete build is the first step. What's repeatable mean? Repeatable means if I do the build 10 times, I get the same build 10 times. It's not one of those things where sometimes I get part of it and sometimes I get something else. What makes a build different? Well, if you ship software and you just dump your production database and ship it with the software, it's probably different every time you do the build. That's probably not the best way to have a repeatable build. You need to make sure that the data you're dumping is complete and repeatable. Informative builds. What's an informative build? People need to know about the build itself. They need to be able to be informed about the build. Did the build pass all of its tests? Did the build get deployed successfully? Is the build currently in a good or a bad state? Because building might not just be for deployment. You might be building to see if QA approves. You might be building to see if the user acceptance testing goes through. You might, if you're getting to a really sort of sexy place on the scheme of build, deploy, and test, be doing continuous integration where your build happens all the time, constantly. And when your build happens all the time, constantly, you need to know whether you've got a red light or a green light with your code, whether your code is green and good to go, or whether someone checked something in that broke something, whether they intended to or not to. And there needs to be a way to get that information out. There's a lot of ways to radiate that information, ranging from emails to lava lamps to cute little Nabaz tag bunnies like that bunny that they have over at the registration desk, those little plastic bunnies. Anything that can flash red and green, you can use to let people know about the information in your build. Anybody can accept email. Anybody can, you can play MP3 songs to talk about whether the build was successful or whether it failed. There's all sorts of crazy things people do with that free time that they've discovered, because now their build's automated and they've got plenty of time. So complete, repeatable, informative, schedulable. I would like to not be up at 2 a.m. to launch my site. I would like to have the computer do it because the computer doesn't care at 2 o'clock. to launch the site. 2 o'clock to it is no different than any other time. It is to me. Schedulable deploy is great, whether that's because you're on continuous integration or because you've scheduled how the deploy process works and you trust it enough because it is complete and repeatable and informative that you know whether it's going to be successful or not. A more sophisticated build process will even roll back if it's not successful. That's a pretty sexy way to do a build. So even if, so your worst case scenario, you sleep through till, the next morning, the 2 a.m. build didn't go out. I would rather have a build that didn't go out than a build that went out and was bad and I got a phone call in the middle of the night about. And finally, portable. People don't believe this, but there are shops. This is much more true in like the C and in some ways the Java world than in the web world. But there are shops where only Bob's machine can build the code because of some code path or some piece of software that only Bob has licensed. There is, you laugh, but there are crazy situations like that. Builds need to be portable. You need to be able to do the build on anything. There's just no reason, no sane reason in my mind that you'd want to build that only works on Bob's machine, because inevitably at 2 in the morning when it's scheduled to go, Bob's machine was unplugged by housekeeping or by the kids that you brought into the office or because of the power outage in that building, and you want to be able to have another machine that can build it. So crisp, if you remember nothing else from this post-lunch caffeine dip, sleepy time, remember crisp builds. And that's Mike Clark's acronym, not mine. So the tools for building, you only need 2 things to be able to build repeatably. You need to have source control, and it doesn't matter what source control you have as long as you have it. And you need an automation tool, which was Ant that I showed you right there. You could do all of this with Visual Source Safe and batch files. You could do all of this with Perforce and Make. You can use any tool that you can schedule, any tool that you can write a script in, and any tool you can store code in to build these sorts of things. I would recommend, especially in the ColdFusion world, that if you're doing source control, you're using Subversion or whatever you've already put in, and that as an automation tool you start with Ant, because that's going to be your easiest sort of starting point in the ColdFusion world. So, how many people use Subversion? All right, lots of hands, so I don't need to belabor how great Subversion is. I will point out that if you're thinking about Subversion and it's the installation of it that's a problem, there are commercial shops that host Subversion for you. I mean, the biggest, most famous is SourceForge on demand. You can pay SourceForge per user per month to handle Subversion for you, and they usually have big, sophisticated dashboard systems and all sorts of neat things integrated into it to help you communicate the information about the builds that you're doing through Subversion and the things that are going on inside Subversion. If you are using Subversion, I don't have a slide, I'll just throw out, Track is a great step. The open source software Track that sits on top of Subversion, it can sit on other stuff, but it really likes to sit on top of Subversion, is a good way to start getting your bug tracking and your builds and your radiation of everything. Yes, ma'am? For Track, for Subversion, subversion.tigris.org, or just look Subversion and it'll take you there. That'll be the first hit on Google, no doubt. Sir? Yeah, that's a great point. If especially, well, it actually doesn't even matter if you're in the Mac world anymore with Fusion. VMware for running virtual machines, there's a couple of appliances for running different build systems, whether that's one with Track or one with, there's definitely Subversion ones. That's certainly there. And a lot of even really vanilla web hosts, like you go get a $40 a month plan with TextDrive, which is one of the big Linuxy open source hosts. They're going to give you a Subversion repository with lots of stuff hooked into it that's going to be great. So Subversion should not be the barrier. Having a machine to install it shouldn't be the barrier. And it doesn't have to be Subversion. I have done this with Visual Source Safe. I've done this with CVS, which I find far worse, believe it or not, than Visual Source Safe, because it just on Windows is it hard to deal with. People use Perforce and Cpine and all these other commercial tools, and all the version control software speaks with them. I've used this with Darks, which is this weird open source. Anyhow, you can do it with just about anything. So that's build. Testing. Seymour Cray from Cray Computers, since they're taping this, I'll read it, even though I know you can. The trouble with programmers is you can never tell what a programmer's doing until it's too late. And if you manage programmers, I bet you know this is true. If you are a programmer, you're saying, no, that can't possibly be true. They know what I'm doing. They don't, whoever they is, whether it's the users or customers or the management chain or whatever. But you never know what a programmer's doing until it's too late, which is why testing across the whole spectrum of the app is really important. Some of you may have seen me talk about testing the other day. I'm just going to whiff through testing very quickly. There's testing at a lot of different levels. You can test at the very low code level with things like CFC unit if you're doing ColdFusion code with CFCs. You can test with JUnit if you've got some Java mixed in. But you're talking about unit testing, usually you're talking about like at the method level, let's say. That's not completely true, but let's say the method level. The place where I think you get a ton of bang for the buck in the web world is Selenium, which just basically lets you automate all of the web testing where you sit there and you click through. Selenium is open source, it's free, there's a recorder for Firefox. You click through it one time, you record it, and now you can play it, and you never have to place an order with your company again to test your software. This is sort of left over. Load testing is important. It's way beyond the scope of things here, and if you're looking open source, Grindr is the painful beat your head against a wall open source solution if you're cross-platform. OpenSTA is the one if you're Windows, and all of them blow. They are all really, really hard to work with. And then the commercial ones are $30,000 and still really, really hard to work with, and then you get more money in consulting. Load testing can be a really tough game. But the testing tools that give you the most bang for the buck are things like Selenium and CFC unit. They just really help you know what's going on both at the code level and at the user level. And when you hook them in with automation tools, here it popped up again, automation tools, that with your testing just starts to be something that happens automatically. You don't have to worry about testing by yourself, and that build before had a test in it. I'll show a Selenium test. I actually didn't set this one up as I should have. So give me just a second here to pull it up, and I'll just tap dance while we're waiting here. There's my Selenium test. This will not be as sexy as testing one of Sean's applications, for instance, for those of you that like the Golden Gate Cat Club framework demos. And it will not be as sexy as testing the CF Pet Market application, which is one that I frequently do. Because that's one a lot of people have seen. What I'm going to do is just run Selenium's test. How many people have ever used something like CFC unit or JUnit or something like that? All right, if you've used one of those, this sort of test runner will look vaguely familiar. Let's see if I plus it over. There we go. This is the test suite that comes with Selenium. Selenium's from OpenQA, openqualityassurance.org. There's a lot of other cool tools there. Runs inside the browser. It's all based on JavaScript. It is dead simple to use. I'm going to just run some tests while I'm talking. This is the suite that comes with it to make sure that Selenium runs. So what it's doing is it's running through the application down here, and everything that's green is what makes programmers happy. That's saying the test passed. Everything that's red is saying a test failed. But I can run this test anytime I want to make sure all the parts of Selenium work. And if I go and change Selenium, I can run it again to make sure I haven't broken anything. And then I automate it, so every time I change Selenium, it checks it out and it tries it for me. All right, so anyhow, that's if you haven't seen Selenium, that might be exciting. Thing number 2 to take home along with Crisp, check out Selenium. Selenium, openqa.org, because it's just really amazing. How many people have QA staff or a QA person or some sort of QA staff? Good, a lot of you all do. What I find is really useful is to give it to the QA people because they're tired of clicking through stuff too. And what they can do then is not only can they automate their tests, but then when they find something that's broken, they can send the programmer the Selenium test that fails, which is just a little HTML file, and the programmer knows how to recreate that test. And then it becomes part of the suite of tests for your application. It becomes a regression test, and you never, ever, ever break that piece of code again, or at least if you do, you know, because you've got a test that shows it. You don't have bugs creep back in. So that wasn't the sexiest possible demo of Selenium, other than the fact that there's a whole lot of tests. It ran over there on the right-hand side. It ran for about 3/4 of a minute and did 530 commands on my Firefox 2.0.4, and 5 of the tests failed. 9 of the commands inside did, and 4 couldn't complete. Well, now I know a little bit better about how well Selenium is running in this copy of Firefox with all the plugins I've got. If I go run this Internet Explorer, which I could if I boot up Fusion, it'll tell me what passes and fails inside that browser. If I go and install Norton Privacy Guard in one of my profiles, it'll tell me what Norton Privacy Guard breaks, or whatever, all these different tools that we're used to breaking. Selenium runs inside the browser. That makes it pretty amazing. It runs just like a user in the browser, so you get browser differences, which is really, really cool. So then, moving on back, automation. If you are going to do anything more than once, you should automate it. Without question, you should automate things if you're going to use it more than once. And automation is where Ant comes in, and to a lesser extent, cruise control. How many people had heard of Ant before they came in here today? That makes me so happy. That is great. In some ways, you'd be hard-pressed not to at least see it, because Adobe uses it, for instance, to push the updater scripts for ColdFusion. And anybody who's ever done anything in Java has probably had to see Ant at least at one point, because Ant just makes things easy. So what I want to do, hang on just a second, I've got too many windows open. What I want to do with a good chunk of the rest of the time is for people who have heard about Ant and are interested in Ant, I want to go through an Ant build file, just to give you an idea that this stuff is not rocket science. You know, you're like, oh, John, you did it in an afternoon, blah, 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 you know what you're doing. It's really not that hard to put it together in an afternoon. So what I want to do is pull up this build file. Pardon me just one second while I bring this over and resize everything. Okay, so Ant, much like every other tool you've had to use with ColdFusion since it became associated with Java, is all XML. All right, so you have to learn a little bit of XML. You should never, ever, ever have to deal with Java to deal with Ant once you have, especially if anyone in here was in my class on Tuesday, once you've installed Java on your machine and got Ant up and running. All right, it's pretty trivial to get Ant up and running if you're comfortable with it. You've got a Java software development kit on your box, and you can set a environment variable. And once you've worked through those 10 or 15 minutes, you're in good shape. So this is a Ant build file, and I'm just going to talk through a couple of kind of like salient points. You'll see that I'm doing properties up there on line 9. It's saying I'm pulling in a file called common.properties. Those are just a bunch of name-value pairs in a text file, so I can set properties. That lets me take my build, put all the common pieces in one place. I've decided that, for instance, I'm going to put all of my repository is in there, the URL to my Subversion repository. But down here, a couple of lines below, I'm setting a new specific one. I'm setting not a whole file of properties. I'm just setting one called target, and I'm setting its value to localhost. And then I'm opening another file. I'm setting a file called, what's that funny thing with brackets? Well, now I'm using one of my properties. I set that target up there to localhost. Now down here, it's going to do localhost.properties, and it's open in localhost because that's the server that I'm going to run it against by default. Why would I do something silly like that? Why would I add the extra line? Well, what I can do now is I can pass it the server name. I have a server name.properties file for each server that I deploy to, and now I've abstracted out the things that are server-specific versus the things that are not server-specific. My repository URL for Subversion and my logins don't change from server to server, so they go into common. My URL that I test against, it sure does change. It might be, like internal.corporate.test, for my test server, and it might be www.corporate.com for production. I'd put that in a machine-specific properties file. Do I have to do it that way? I could hard code all these. I could write a bunch of properties files, and that makes fine sense when you're getting started. But what over time I've come to learn is how to abstract these things out to make it simpler. So that's just pulling in some properties. We go down a little more. I'm setting a couple of values there. I'm using an internal function called timestamp to pull a timestamp. And then I'm setting another property. You find that a lot of stuff inside Subversion is setting properties, and then you do something with those properties. Setting properties and do something. I said Subversion, I'm in Ant. Setting properties and doing something with them. The reason you don't see a lot of programming inside this, first of all, because it's XML, and second, because James Duncan Davidson, the guy who wrote Ant, beats himself over the head daily for never having put any sort of scripting framework into Ant. He said if he had his chance to do it all again, he'd do it in one of the Bean Shell scripting frameworks for Java, but he doesn't have to worry about that because he's now a Ruby guy and he does everything in Rake. So, either way, we don't have to do a lot other than setting properties. Basically, all those couple of lines up there are doing is I'm setting a label. I'm setting a label. Why am I setting a label? Well, we'll find out in a second. Then I'm doing something that actually is a little funky. I am loading a new task. Ant is extensible. Ant comes with, I don't know, like, 70 or 80 sets of tasks right out of the box, and a lot of people have written additional tasks. For whatever insane clash of ego reasons, the Subversion people do not distribute the plugin for Subversion with Ant. You have to install it yourself. It makes no sense because all of them use Subversion, but CVS is built in. It's kind of like when you when you build Eclipse or you download Eclipse. Eclipse has CVS built in, but it doesn't have Subversion, and you have to go out and get Subclipse. It's just stupid that it works like that. Ironically, you get the SVN Ant plugin from the same place as Subclipse. It doesn't even really have its own website. It's just kind of buried in the Subclipse site. So let me just skim down through a couple more because those are tasks that I haven't shown you yet. So basically, I've set a bunch of properties, and I'm going to do some stuff. And if we go back to there we go. If we go back, you'll see that I did this init function, and it said it did 3 make directories. Well, if I flip back over to the code, up at the top there's some function called init, and it's got these 3 XML things called make directory that I passed some properties files, and it was going to make me some properties. It's going to make me some files. So right now, the XML isn't very hard to understand when you see what it's doing over here. It's creating my source, my build, and my dist subdirectories, and those are all set up by properties that I set because I like to call my directories source, build, and distribution, which is pretty much a semi-standard in Ant. So what's the next step after this init? Well, it's this thing called export app. What's export app? This is the only thing that's even partially interesting, I think, out of all this. Down here's my export app. And I'm going to do 2 things, because remember I said that you always wanted to do a crisp build if at all possible. I want to be able to know exactly what I exported. So that means if this makes sense to Subversion people, I don't want to export ever, I don't want to ever use trunk for my deployment. Why do I not want to use trunk for deployment? Because tomorrow trunk is different than trunk is today. So how do I do my deployment? The very first thing I do up there, I'm popping open SVN to give it a username and password so it can connect to Subversion for me. The very first thing I do is a copy. And I do a copy from trunk, because that's where in my development world everything's in trunk. And because this is kind of a small screen, I'll scroll it over. I'm going to copy from trunk to tags in the build label that I set up further in the code with a timestamp. So what I'm going to do is every time I run this build, I am going to create a new tag. Oh no, Subversion's filling up. It's running out of revision numbers. No, it's not. If you look at the Apache projects, a lot of the Apache code repositories are up in the 500, 600, 700, I don't think they're up to 700 yet. 500 and 600,000 revisions in the repository. Subversion doesn't care. And when you do a tag from trunk, the copy takes up so little space it's meaningless because there's nothing different. It's just kind of like a snapshot pointer. It's saying that's what the code looked like at this point. So I am copying to a tag that's named on the time that this is running. That's how I'm doing it right now. And then once I do that, I've copied it. Super, John, you've got a tag. What am I going to do now? Now I'm going to do an export. I'm going to do a clean export from that tag's build label that I just created, and that's what I'm going to ship out. So now, if the user tells me, hey, there was a problem with that app, I have a label for it. I know exactly when that build happened. I don't have to go back and say, well, was that on Tuesday or Wednesday because we did deployments both days. I know where it came from. To make sure I know where it came from, I'm going to do a couple of more tricks. So right now, all I've done is I've tagged it, and I've exported a copy from the tag. You can do equivalent things in other source control systems if you wish, if you happen to use one of those. So after that export, I did a build. Note up there after the name equals build, it says depends on export app. You might have seen depends a couple of times. Ant knows all about dependencies. So what that's saying is if I tell it to build, it will not build unless I do an export first. It makes sure export has happened one way or another before I do that build. Well, super. So now I've done my copy to a tag. I've done my export from that tag. And now I'm getting ready to build, and there's a whole bunch of junk in there, but basically you see a copy tag, which means I'm copying, and I've got a file set and a filter set. Well, what I'm doing there is I'm going to throw out a couple of things that Ant can do, so you maybe remember it can do it, even if you don't remember how, and you know you can look it up because it's not too hard. What I'm doing is I'm going to copy everything from the source directory to the build directory. If you look over there on the right under my tree, you see source, dist, and build, that very first init task created. Well, it wasn't just because I want to slavishly do what all the Java people do that I did that. I did that for a reason. I checked out everything that was raw from that, I shouldn't say checked out. I exported everything from that tag that I created from trunk. So I've got a copy of trunk that's tagged. I exported in the source. Now I am going to copy everything in that source directory to the build directory. Why on earth would I want to take my 8 gigs of data and copy it from my source directory to my my source directory to my build directory? Well, what I'm going to do in the process, I can do things like run filters. Filters are a way to embed text inside of a file anywhere in your code, and have Ant replace it. So I'm telling it I've got this token called version, and I'm going to replace it with the build label. What I'm basically doing is down at the bottom of index.html or index.cfm or my layout.cfm or wherever that I'd like to tell the user what version this software is. I've got @version@, which is the magic token way to tokenize a word. So I put ampersands around version inside a piece of, inside one file. I could do it inside 1,000 files. I could do it inside no files. It doesn't care. It's just going to look for @version@ and replace that with build label. So now on my index.html page, it has the name of that label I exported from, so everybody knows what they're testing. All right, this testing that whoever's getting ready to do is repeatable from my build because my build is crisp. So I've filtered. I have copied everything over to that build directory, and I'm going to do one more crazy thing. There's a concat. I'm going to concatenate 2 files together. Well, I'm really not passing in a file. So what I'm doing is basically writing one more file that's not in my source code repository. It's not in the source directory. It's only going to live in the build directory that says, hey, you built this file, and has the name of the tag. The file name is build directory, build label. That's going to be the actual name of the file. And its contents say built on start today. So if I look over here in build, if the world's good to me, there's my build. And over there's the time, 6/29/228. So that's the file that we built a few minutes ago. So now I've got everything that I needed there. I think if I look in index, I've been through a lot with this Subversion repository. So I may or may not have the version still in there. I think I edited it out in the class the other day. So that's not very helpful. But anyhow, so now I've got my build. So I've taken my source files. I've modified them a little, putting them into my build in a repeatable way. Every time I run this build script again, it will modify them the same way by adding those files that I told it to. Now, my final step, what do I want to do? I want to deploy this app. Or I want to distribute it, either one. And so in my case, I'm going to talk about deploying. I'm going to copy it one more time. But this time I'm going to copy what's in the build directory, which pretty much all I did was added a file and replace the stuff with version, so it has the version written in it. I'm going to copy that to my distribution directory, or here, what I'm doing here is copying it directly to my deployment server. Right now it's a copy because it's local. I could deploy this across SSH, across FTP. I could deploy this to a disk, write a checksum for it, put it onto the USB drive that the low-paid lackey in your staff runs out to the colo once a month, however that works. So now I've got a repeatable build, all run by Ant, that's, if you look, there's a lot here that we haven't even talked about because they're tasks we haven't talked about at all. I've got 130 odd lines of mostly blank lines and extra spacing for XML. This is not a lot of work. If you thought, wow, I could never automate my build, it would take too much time, it doesn't take too much time to get your build automated. And so finally, I just want to throw out this thing here. Well, I'll throw out 2 things. There's my sexy little task that'll run the Selenium suite. There's a task that comes with Selenium that hooks right into Ant. Boy, that's nice. And what it does is it will, when I tell it to, it'll run Selenium tests. It will actually run my Selenium tests, and at the end of it, see where it says results equal up there, deploy dir, so results place, blah, blah. It's posting that page into the results directory so I can find it. I could email it to myself if I want to do that as part of this, but I'm actually going to post it up on the app so everyone can see what the status of the tests are. And I can put a bunch of these Selenium commands in there. You notice there's that thing that says browser star Firefox. I can put browser star IE Explorer. I can put, well, I have to use custom, but I can make it Opera. I can make it Conqueror if I'm running this thing on Linux. I mean, I can run just about any browser, get the results against that test that I want, include that in my build, so already the QA person, when they come in the morning, sees there's a new build, here's the test so far. Now you know what the status of it is. It's all green. Go try to break it some more. I mean, that's a big step from where you might be right now. And I'm even doing some crazy things down here just to show you I can do them in case it matters to you. There's two things I'm going to show. One is, there's my task archive. Well, archive, I'm introducing one more ant task. It's called zip. Well, what's that doing? Destination file, there's a base directory, updates true. I'm making a zip file, and then I'm making a checksum for it, so that'll let me take my open source project. If, like, let's say this is an open source ColdFusion application, I can zip it up every night as part of my nightly build, generate the MD5 checksum for that so people don't have to be scared to download it. And then if I tie that to a deploy action, push it out to my server at RiaForge or wherever I'm hosting my application. You know, 130 lines, mostly of empty space and formatting because it's XML, all right? So Ant is not something to be scared about. And if you look down here at the bottom, there's even a couple more things. One of the primary problems we have in the ColdFusion world, well, in the web world in general, is when you're testing is dealing with data. What I find is almost without exception, you really need to reset the database to a known state if you're really going to test the application and automate it, because if there's different data every time in the app, your tests either get really complicated or they get really brittle and break all the time because, oh yeah, I already registered as user John, so I can't register as John again because I can only register once. Crap, all the tests say username equals John. Well, if I reset my database to a known state every time, I know I can run them every time. How on earth can I reset my database? Well, there's a lot of ways to do it. You can, if you are comfortable with the command line, Ant will shell out to the command line, so you can do a restore. Like if you're a SQL Server person, I guess what? Command line, you'd OSQL it or whatever you do now in SQL 2005. If you're a MySQL person or a Postgres person, you can use the command line utilities there. If you would rather put Java in the mix, there's a whole set of tasks around this tool called DB-Unit for unit testing databases that basically have things that hook into Ant for using JDBC to export schemas. So you can say this is the schema and this was the data that went into it before you run the test. Then you can either reset the data after the test is done, reset it before the app starts. You can even dump the data before, dump the data after, and compare it using DB-Unit to make sure it's at the known state that you thought it should be at after the entire set of tests is run, and let people know. That's, you know, easy to install. It's starting to be more work to get all these pieces. You know, you're starting to see that, wow, there's all these different directions we can go. There are a lot of different directions you can go. And usually what you do is you find the point that's the biggest pain, and you make that go away. And if you get rid of that, if you could just today I sound like one of those spokesmen, right? If you could just today go ahead, reach into your heart and find the capability to spend a few minutes automating those tests that you do over and over and over, what would you do with that extra time every day not having to go through the orders again? You know, there's a couple of answers. I'm not pointing any fingers, you know, because I say, you know, take a coffee break. You know, go take a coffee break, go take a walk, go work out with that extra 45 minutes. You might say, write CFC unit tests with all that extra time now that you've got your Selenium stuff done. But you're going to start saving time, and you're going to be focusing on what programmers are supposed to focus on. And I mean, no in any disrespect, you might be able to get rid of your QA person if all your QA person does is click, right? You know, and that would certainly be our return on investment if you're that kind of driven shop, though not that I'm advocating that directly. So that's the Ant build file. So putting it all together, I just, because I'm that kind of guy, I want to talk real quick about the Agile Manifesto, because Agile is something that's big in the world of software development, whether it's C programming or Java programming or web programming, but it's very, very noticeable in the lightweight web framework world, like the Ruby people who are running Rails or the Django people. And it's been in kind of a weird way, it's been what ColdFusion's been arguing all along, that, you know, we can make things faster and cheaper and better. Well, the Agile Manifesto is worth just taking a look at, because smart people who came up with the Pragmatic Programmers line of software, people who wrote books like Bob Martin and Martin Fowler, books about refactoring and agile development. These people, Kent Beck, father of the extreme movement, Alistair Coburn, who writes great books on use cases and how to write use cases and how to analyze software development methodologies. They basically summarized everything they've learned, again, and we're talking about being pragmatic. Remember, I'm not talking about theoretical here. I'm talking about what they have learned practically. The theory is not really worth a lot. The theoretical process of software development led us to waterfall in a lot of cases. What they found practically is that people and interactions matter over processes and tools. Working software matters more than comprehensive docs. Customer collaboration matters more than negotiating contracts. And responding to change matters more than following a plan. And they're very clear. They say, what we're saying is the stuff on the right isn't unimportant. It's just the stuff on the left is more important. So how does that affect what we're talking about today? Well, what I'm talking about is some tools. So I'm kind of off on that first one there. But they're tools that let you focus on saving time to give you more time for all this other stuff. And they're tools that definitely support working software because you've got tests. You know your software works. Instead of spending your time documenting it and writing use cases and hoping that it works. It also really affects this bottom one down here, which is responding to change over following a plan. If you know your code works and you've got tests that show it works, then maybe if you want to try upgrading from Fusebox 5 to Fusebox 5.5, why not? You've got tests, you know? And so worst case scenario, you spend an afternoon doing it, you run your tests, 30 tests fail, you poke at it a little while, you're like, hey, not ready to do this. Or you're like, hey, you know, I want to migrate this backend from our lame object, our object system over to transfer or over to reactor or something like that. You've got the time to do that, and you've got the flexibility to do that because you're running tests, and you'll know if something breaks, and you can automate the build, and you can go back to the build that worked before you broke everything. So it takes away a lot of the fear. So these are a bunch of Agile practices. Planning is a big part of it. Iterating in short cycles. Continuous integration is the one that's really relevant in what we've been talking about. Continuous integration is when you get to the point that something, whether it's cruise control or a cron script that you wrote or Windows Task Scheduler or something's sitting there looking at your Subversion repository, looking at your Perforce repository all the time. Code's changed, it runs tests, and it lets everybody know. That's what continuous integration is all about, and that's where you can get without too much effort. You start with automated builds, then you move to scheduled nightly builds, and then you move to continuous integration, and all of them are your same ant file. You can do all of that with this ant file. It'd take you the first day to figure out the ant, the second day to get it into cron if you're not familiar with Linux, and then it'd take you an afternoon to get cruise control working. And by the end of those few afternoons, you'd have a continuous integration system up and running in your shop. And you can see it's important enough that I put it over there as its own thing too. Because continuous integration supported by testing, supported by short cycles, and supported by some decent planning lets you refactor very easily. It lets you not be afraid of changing your code, and you shouldn't have to be afraid of changing your code. And I'm starting to sound preachy again. So finally, while I'm preachy, the guys who wrote Peopleware, and I'll read it again for the audio tape. The average software developer doesn't own a single book on the subject of his or her work and hasn't even read one. And that fact is horrifying for anyone concerned about the quality of work in the field, and for people who write books, it's positively tragic. It's not as self-serving as it sounds. So I'll tell you, I told my other group this, and here's the answers. For years, one of my early phone interview questions is something along the lines of, name 3 books that are the first to come out of your box, or the first that go on your shelf, or the first you order, whatever the way you frame it. What 3 books do you have to be a software programmer wherever you're working? What do you have to be comfortable? And honestly, I don't care what the answer is personally. Most of the time, it's can you name 3 books? I would prefer if they aren't the 2 books that Ben Forda and company wrote, and I don't know. I'd like if one other book, was in there. But I don't really care what the books are. But it's sad to see how many times people have said, and I'm not knocking you if you haven't, but I'm encouraging you, if you haven't, to pick a couple of these books to read. I'm giving you a short list of ones I particularly find. This is not like these are the only ones, but I find books about software process and not the necessarily technology of the month, the books that you keep on your shelf. How many people still have ColdFusion 4 Web Application Construction Kit on their shelf? Yeah, not so many. If you do, you might have 5 or 6 or 7 next to it. But that 4 book helped at the time, but it really, was a step. It really didn't get you to a new place as a developer or something like that. And the books I like to see are books that take you to a new place as a developer, give you a solid set of skills that might really help. And it just happens that the guys at the Pragmatic Programmers write a lot of those books. There are other ones. Code Complete by Steve McConnell is a Microsoft one. There's a whole cluster of Microsoft ones. Addison Wesley has some good ones. But a really good, probably if you could buy 1 or 2 books, this is the worst title for a technology book ever, and probably one of the best ones you can get, especially if you're an independent consultant and you're worried about making yourself relevant, or if you work at a big company and you're worried about getting laid off. My job went to India, and all I got was this lousy book by Chad Fowler. It's a spectacular book about how to invest in yourself as a software developer, and a lot of its advice is funny because it's contradictory, because sometimes there's multiple paths you can take. Like one is invest in the hottest new technology, which is great, because the time I spent learning Groovy was really worth it, because I did spend a lot of time learning Groovy, and I see so few people nodding their heads, because Groovy really didn't get any traction. I knew Groovy 2.5 years ago. If I had learned Ruby 2.5 years ago, I'd be in a different place and a lot happier. The other thing he says, for instance, is learn a language that no one cares about that's dying. So like if you're a RGP programmer or a COBOL programmer or a Fortran programmer, there's another career move. But he has lots of advice for making yourself a lot more of a useful developer in the long term, which is very pragmatic because it keeps you employed as opposed to thinking what might be useful to learn. It's very pragmatic advice about that. And the other one's Practices of an Agile Developer. Those are 2 spectacular books. For those of you that live in the DC area, the guys that did Practices of an Agile Developer and Ship It, which is a book about shipping software on time, and Deploy It, which is a companion one, they're doing a class here in Reston, and I'm blanking on the date. But anyhow, that's enough of me preaching. Again, I'm John Ashenfelter. I will happily answer questions about Ant. There is a lot of info out there on Ant. I'll happily talk about Selenium and anything else. I appreciate your time. I work at Transition Point down the road here in the Shenandoah Valley, and that's it. But let me do questions before anything else. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yes, you do. That's a good question. To run the Selenium task, you do need the browser that you're running the task on. So your production server would need Firefox, for instance, if you're going to run Firefox on it. And if you really have a lot of browser compatibility machines or situations to deal with, it probably means you're running some of your tests on a VMware box and some of your tests on a Mac or whatever, which gets a lot more complex. But yeah, you have to have the actual browser running. Yes, sir. Yes, and I will get it up on the wiki after I as soon as I can. And if not, it'll end up at my site. It'll end up on the wiki. It'll end up at my site, and you all can pester me because you have my info, because that is a very straightforward. Yes, sir. Like for something like Flex or Flash or something like that, or for. Oh yeah, that's a good question, and I've been asked that a lot, and I've asked that question a lot at other conferences, and I've never heard an extremely good answer. The question was, what do you do about visually testing the site? And yeah, I have never heard a really good answer for how you visually test the process. And what the glib answer I normally get back, so I sort of pass it on, is that you've saved so much time by testing the functionality of the site. Now you've got time for a person to look at the site. But if you're talking about like making sure CSS works, across the browsers or something like that, that's a place where there's a lot of trouble. And for anyone that's thinking about asking the question about Flash and Flex, there are commercial tools for doing Flash and Flex. There's an open source one called Autotest Flash, which I've had very poor results with personally, but I'm not a Flash guy, so you shouldn't take that from me. And I did not go to the continuous integration and testing with Flex class, but the answer Adobe keeps telling me is buy WebRunner, WinRunner, whatever the runner, it's the runner suite. Basically, they're like buy the runner suite, and that'll let you test stuff like Flex and Flash. So was that close enough, or did I miss your question? Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. For which? It's at apache.org. ant.apache.org. It is a top-level Apache project. So, and it shouldn't be a problem to anyone because Apache license is very corporate-friendly. Selenium GPL. I can't remember whether Selenium's GPL or Apache. it's fairly friendly, and you shouldn't have to modify it, and you definitely shouldn't deploy Selenium with your application out in the world. Yes, sir. Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. Yeah, the comment was that Ant's already built into Eclipse, and it is. So you can run Ant tasks inside of Eclipse, so you can run your deploys locally there. You can, whether they're local or remote, you can automate your CFC unit tests in there with Ant, which is something that we worked with Paul last year at the conference and got that knocked out, and Mark and Paul made it much better and hooked it all in. So if you're using Eclipse in your workflow, then it's just golden. So I had a very server-centric sort of point of view here, but if you're using Eclipse, it's great. Yes, sir, I'm sorry. Yeah, what you can do, Ant is smart, generally. So, like, for instance, if you didn't want to do, I'm neurotic about clean exports every time. You can have it just check it out, for instance. Or you can have it do things like you can have a repository, you can have your build directory, so you can kind of do it yourself. You can have like the checked out repository and the last build repository, and it's smart enough to diff them and only move the ones that need to. And because I am neurotic about completely clean builds, Ant, if it's already done, won't redo it. If you tell it to make directories, it looks to see if the directories are there first before it makes them again. If you tell it, to check something out and you just checked it out, it won't recheck it all out because it knows it's already done it. So it keeps track of stuff like that. So there are a lot of ways to approach that. I'm just totally neurotic about clean builds. So yep. Yeah, so you can model just about any build process that you are interested in. And I find sometimes that people on deployment servers, on integration and testing servers, use checkout instead of export. And I kind of get that, especially if it's a big one and it's remote and you've got a DSL line to go across and stuff like that. I totally get that. I was kind of like thinking production deploys where I'm really, really neurotic. But yeah, you had a question, sir, back there. Of the ColdFusion templates, there was one back in the ColdFusion 6 days. Basically, if any command line that you can have, I don't compile any of my ColdFusion on the fly, but if you wanted to jar, if you wanted to war or ear it up and use all those tools for the enterprise deployment of ColdFusion, you could potentially do that. I've never done that. But yeah, I couldn't hear everything you said, Rob. There you go. So you can there's an Ant task called exec, which basically shells out to the command line, and anything that's not built into Ant, if you don't feel like writing it in Java, exec is the way to do it. I used to use exec for SVN all the time because I should say, just as an aside, you want the latest SVN Ant task because the previous one just will make you bang your head against the wall because it's got these dependencies on Java HL, which works on 4 machines out of 5, and then the 5th one there's no way to make it work on for some reason no one can explain, and you bang your head against a wall. And you want the one that's pure Java, which is the SVN Ant 1.1. Or you want to shell out to the command line, which is how a lot of the tasks are written. How is Visual Source Safe integrated into all these open source tools? There's a VSS task that wraps the command line, that vss.exe file. So yeah, that was a good question for pre-compiling stuff. But there's Ant tasks for anything that most rational people would do. And if you can't, you can wrap something up. Like let's say you want to reset your redo all your reactor templates. You want to recompile them on the production server, and if you need to hit it through the web, you can shell out to curl or one of the command line things that can hit a URL or something like that. You can hook into validation, if you don't mind being Windows specific. I was looking up because someone asked me. I actually used to use HTML Validator, the Windows app that came years and years ago with HomeSite on Windows to validate files at the end of running some of these things to make sure I had valid HTML. There's all sorts of crazy things you can do. And Ant just has been extended till there's a ridiculous number of tasks, and about this many are useful for web apps because it's very Java-centric. You can build Java files if you've got credit card stuff that integrates with VeriSign that's a jar or something. You can include that stuff. You can include anything. So who still has a question? I think yes, sir. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is, can you run Ant from basically inside of a ColdFusion app? And first of all, there's like a ReaForge project that I haven't used called Ant Farm. That's Oh, they use CFX to get to it. Yeah, huh? Off the top of my head, I don't know for sure. But what's gonna be problematic is, anytime you're dealing with ColdFusion, you can get into class path hell. And Ant is very specific about its class paths. And depending on what version of Ant you're using, some of the versions of Ant don't like certain versions of If you're using a recent version of Ant, you need to use a recent version of Java and vice versa. That's probably not a problem if you're running ColdFusion 7 or 8, because both of those are higher. Rob, you want to? Mm. That is an excellent point, the CF Ant task. There you go. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ganda. You can tell I've been doing rake too much lately. So CFAnt, the internal undocumented ColdFusion command. Um, yeah, yeah, cool. So it makes it easy to find. Cool. Well, I'll wrap up. I'll be happy to stand up here and answer more questions. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference, and thanks for spending your afternoon with me and listening to me preach. I really do appreciate it.